Hey, what's up guys? Bullet here with Gritshift. Today I'm going to be showing you guys how to install the KO motor and controller on your Sauron. I definitely say that this is a lot easier than installing a Bach controller because you don't have all the extra phase wire leads and the controller harnesses and stuff like that. It's definitely a simple process. So this is how you're going to receive your KO setup. Very nice box. Some really nice packaging too. Literally, there's like some suede material here. They went over the top of the packaging, I'd say. Pretty nice. Motor and controller are both in a baggie. We have a new sprocket nut here. Very nice coloring on the anodizing. Blue is almost like a royal blue color. I'd say it's probably gonna match pretty well with the guys that have blue frames. Controller is also in a bag. Very nice, and this is actually pretty light. I'd say this is probably lighter than a Bach controller. And this is the best part about this controller. This plug's removable, so then you could easily swap this plug out, this Sauron harness, with a Teleria harness and swap this controller over to Teleria. So some of the tools that I'm using here is going to be a number 3 Phillips head screwdriver, impact gun with a 17 and 18 millimeter socket, a number 4, 5, and 6 Allen wrench. Before you do anything on the bike is obviously shut off your breaker. I already disassembled mine just because I had a custom wiring harness, so I had to revert it all back to stock, including reinstalling my OEM speed control switch and display. So it's really simple. There's a plastic guard here on the stock controller. You're going to remove that to 4 millimeter Allens. You're going to gain access to the mounting points up top here. The bottom of the controller has 2 mounting points here and here. And then also you're going to have to remove this plastic guard as well. There's going to be 2 Phillips head bolts here, and I believe these are 4 mil or 5 mil mounting points here for this plastic guard on both sides. Once you remove those, you'll have access to remove your controller. After you remove your controller, you're going to want to remove both of these bolts here. One on this side and one on the other side. So before you remove your motor, I would recommend getting a 17 millimeter socket and removing your sprocket nut here. That way you could pull this pulley off once the motor is removed. It's going to be a lot harder when you pull the motor out and then you try to do that, because this sprocket is going to rotate with the motor. You're going to start with the skid plate. A lot of people, they just loosen up these 2 bottom bolts. Do not remove them all the way. And then these 2 top bolts here, remove these all the way. Then you'll be able to just slide your skid plate down like this, and you'll have full access to the motor. The motor has 4 mounting points, one right here, one right here. Same for the other side. There's going to be doubles. One's going to be for a skid plate, one's going to be for the motor. The larger Allen bolt is for the motor. So this is going to be the bolt orientation. I have the frame screws that mount the electrical panel, the top controller bolts, the side controller bolts, the 2 top skid plate bolts, the left side front motor mount, the left side rear motor mount with spacers, all in the correct orientation, and then the right side motor mount, front, right side rear motor mount. All right, so on to installing the motor. When you're installing this, do not force anything on. I'm going to go ahead and put the belt on first, just so it kind of gives support to holding the motor up. Belt on. I'm going to reach around the back side and just kind of turn this a little bit to line up the front motor mount bolts. Once I see that's kind of lined up, I'm going to go ahead and get my spacer, put that between the motor and the frame. Once that's between there, I pull towards me just to kind of hold that spacer in place, slide the bolt halfway through, and then you're just going to have to line up the motor mount hole. I usually leave it like this before I screw it in, and I just go to the other side. This doesn't have a spacer, and it's going to be a lot easier to see the motor hole. Start threading it through, and you're going to want to leave all these motor bolts loose. Do not tighten them, because then you're going to be fighting with the other side spacers. Start fastening this one. All right, everything nice and loose still. So now we're going to do our cam gear spacer in this orientation, spacer against the motor, cam gear against spacer, and cam gear against frame. So again, this is the reason why I have everything loose. I could move the motor up and down slightly to fit the cam gear and the spacer in place. And then I just look through the motor mount hole. Once I have that lined up, I put the motor bolt through and then thread that into the motor. Gonna do the same thing with the other side. All 4 motor mount bolts in. I'm gonna go ahead and grab my cam gear here, just slide that up all the way. I actually gotta loosen this a little bit because it's too tight. Slide this up. Belt tension is gonna be the most important thing on this install, because if you put your belt too tight, you will snap it as soon as dirt or a rock or something gets between your belt and your sprocket. And if it's too loose, you'll strip the gears or the ribs off of the belt. So I usually like 2 to 3 mils up and down play, so 4 to 6 in total. So I usually just push this up as hard as I can with one finger, and that usually gets me where I want. That's a little too loose, so I'm gonna go ahead and just push it up a little bit more. I'd say that's just about right there. Go around, put all of them hand tight, and then I'll go ahead and crank them down. All right, after you have all of your motor bolts nice and tight, go ahead and check belt tension again just to make sure nothing moved around. I wouldn't install the skid plate yet, just so you have more room to connect all your phase wires and everything like that. I do want to note something though. These original OEM skid plates are notorious for bending and all kinds of stuff like that. Mine's been rebent back like 7 times already. So just keep an eye when you're putting this back up in place. Just check for contact points, because you might have to bend your skid plate out a little bit if your skid plate has been bent. So we're gonna go ahead and start with the install on the controller. I had already removed all the Phillips head screws here. They're all the same length, so it doesn't matter which orientation you reinstall them back in. I'm gonna go ahead and start with the phase wires. They're all color coordinated. So yellow with yellow, green with green, blue with blue, obviously. I'm just gonna pre-thread these. All right, now that I have all these pre-threaded, I'm gonna go ahead and tighten them down with my number 3 screwdriver. These all have locking washers too, so they don't have to be super tight. I'm just kind of getting them snug right now, and then I'll go back around all of them and re-tighten all of them. Now that that's all done, I'm gonna go ahead and plug in my hall sensor. I have this all secured up top, so it's kind of out of the way. Now that we're done with those phase wires, power wires, and stuff like that, the harness that goes to the bottom, right in front of the motor, we have the hall sensor that's obviously coming out of the motor, and then we have the hall sensor plug on the main harness. I'm gonna go ahead and plug these in. Once those are plugged in, it's gonna look like that. And now I'm gonna kind of tuck these wires all back in this. Once that's all done, it's gonna just go right under there, just like so. So now I'm gonna connect my controller plugs to my main harness. All these plugs are all different, so they can only plug into one plug. So in other words, you can't mix and match them. You gotta push them all the way in until they click. This plug right here, you're gonna just leave alone. That's not gonna do anything. And now I'm gonna pull this plate back that we took the bolts out of earlier on both sides, because now I'm gonna push these wires up under the ignition cover. Pull this cover back. Now I'm gonna pull my controller wires up. We have our controller wires right here under the ignition switch. I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of center these all up. We have a mounting point right here and right here. When we push this plate back together, just watch these corners, make sure they don't pinch any wires. You shouldn't have to force anything at all. You kind of just push it right in and it'll line right up. Now we're gonna reinstall the screws back into this metal plate, and then we'll go and reorganize the wires and plugs and everything under the ignition cover, just so it kind of gives us more room. I still have my ignition in place, so I shouldn't really have to move much around, but just to make sure nothing's like binding or rubbing or anything like that, it's always good. Just looking at everything, we don't have any like tension on any of the plugs or anything like that. Everything moves pretty freely. So now we're gonna go ahead and mount our controller. You're gonna wanna start at the top. The controller harness, you're gonna wanna push this aside. There's a bracket right here. that the controller mounts to on these two mounting points. So you want to push that harness aside so you don't pinch the wires. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of push it up right there. And then once that's in place, I will get my controller mounting bolts and just hand thread that in. Once both of those are hand threaded in, now you're just going to want to look in the back, make sure no wires are pinched or, you know, in a weird spot or anything like that. Should be pretty all straightforward if you organized your wires beforehand. Then you just push the controller back. Your side mounting bolts are going to be pretty short because they do bottom out on the controller. So don't try to force these in or over tighten them or anything like that. Last thing to do before you're ready to ride is just remounting the skid plate. I usually make sure that these are on here tight so they don't fall off. Make sure that these are lined up where you could see through them. Once you do that, I will say these phase wires are very firm. So I kind of pushed mine up and out of the way so they don't hit the skid plate here. I'm gonna just slide this back up in place. And it should slide right in place. So once you have the controller, motor, skid plate, everything mounted back up, wires rerouted, go ahead and flip your breaker back on after your battery's plugged in, obviously. When you turn your ignition on, you should hear a beep. That single beep means that the system's okay and it's booted up. If you turn the ignition on and there's throttle applied, it will beep simultaneously. So if it does that, you know that there's an error, there's something going on. I haven't had that issue before, but throughout testing and stuff like that, I found some of those cool little features on the controller. So we're gonna go ahead and give this a little test drive. I'm gonna just spin the tire up really quick. Everything works.